I declare it time to begin. Hello everybody, welcome to Designing for a Purpose. We will talk a little more about what specifically that means, because it's kind of a general topic, but we actually have some very specific purposes that we're going to be talking about today. Hi, I'm Rebecca Slitt, I'm your moderator. We're going to start by having some conversation among the panelists, and then we will open it up for questions, and we will have a lot of time for questions. So first, I would like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Please say your name, your pronouns, where you're from, and what your interest in this topic is, why you are here. And many of you will recognize some of these folks from the EduLARP conference and or the keynotes. So this is going to be a chance to hear some more about their work. So take it away.
So my name is Elizabeth Fein, she, her pronouns. I'm assistant professor of psychology at Fein University in Pittsburgh. I'm kind of cross-trained as a psychologist and anthropologist, and I'm interested in the intersection of culture and neurodevelopmental differences. So my last big project was on autism spectrum conditions and different kind of ways that people on the spectrum make sense of their experience. What does it mean to be on the spectrum? How does this get negotiated in different kinds of contexts? I wound up spending some time with the Wayfinders doing an Asperger's specific camp. It was a wonderful experience, and so ever since then I've kind of had in the back of my mind thinking about LARPing as a really, really powerful experience for people on the spectrum and how to make those experiences more accessible to them.
Hello, I'm Hakan. Along with Catherine, I'm Party Games, and we generally make games about stories about language, so language death, language conversions, stuff like that. Within our games, we try to tell stories that are kind of different than are usually covered in the RPG spectrum, especially around as it relates to cultural identity, especially around the frame of language, but also trying to get different types of emotions out of players, right? What does it mean to end the game in a hopeful state? What does it mean to do these sort of things? And so, yeah, that's my background, and look forward to talking about the game.
Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Andersson. I come here from Norway, where my LARP background is kind of split in two. On the one side, I've been working in the Norwegian NGO called Seaforbundet with LARP projects that have a very specific aim to strengthen civil society and to educate the people involved to become more aware and more global citizens. And on the other hand, I'm also the co-owner of a small LARP company called Bouvier, and we work a lot with learning games, and especially for children and teenagers, and how to incorporate LARP as part of a larger learning process with pre- and post-work, and also how to apply acknowledged learning theories into the way we design those LARPs.
Great, so thank you. So some of the purposes that we're going to be talking about today, fortunately there are a lot of panels at this conference that talk about designing with other specific purposes in mind. There are other panels about feminist design and queer design and other things like that. We're going to be talking today about social purposes of education, disability advocacy, disability support, cross-cultural communication, and using LARP to foster communication as a whole. And we're going to be talking a lot about some design best practices, because this is on the design track. And so I want to get into a lot of the nitty-gritty about how to make these games and how to make games that support these goals. And that's going to start building on what we've heard in the keynotes, talking about the best practice of organizing from Anna, and just digging deeper into what Hakan talked about in his keynote with Catherine. So let's start with talking about those distinctions. You have content that advocates for social change, and you also have design that advocates for social change. I'd love to hear you talk about some of the ways that that those two things can support each other. How can your design techniques support the content of social change that you're trying to incorporate. Okay. Hi, new folks. Welcome to Design for a Purpose. Take a seat wherever. You may be in the circle, you may be inside or outside, wherever.
Nobody's in and nobody's out.
All right, we got make your circles.
We'll design for inclusivity.
Yes. We are designing this circle for the purpose of everybody fitting into it.
Except Susan's going to be in the
Yeah.
middle. But she's more important than anybody
First,
else.
go ahead. At this point, let's start passing around the microphone because the group is
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Now you can keep sliding.
Testing. Testing. Hello. 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 Nope, not on. I mean, the little thingy says on, but. And you all now have 4 times. Hello? Yeah. Okay, nope, hold it like about there. All right, so, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, so when I think of content and design, really, like, one of the biggest things that strikes out at me is that, like, it's very easy to put a game in a certain content and in a certain setting, and really think that by putting it in a certain setting and expecting your players immediately to empathize with what's going on can really take you down to the wrong places, especially around the fact that your game has to be engaging, it has to be fun, it has to have something that keeps the players actually playing it, but also you need to be very conscious about the emotions that your players are actually taking out of it, right? That's going to be a large part of the design process, and the design and mechanics and how those actually elicit emotions and how those come up against the content that you're presenting seems to be like a core part of what's going on, right? It's not enough to just put players in a really uncomfortable situation and think that they're going to take the right lessons out of it. And I feel like I see a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah. So what are some design techniques that you've used to overcome that problem?
Mm-hmm. Some of the design techniques I think that I've used in particular to overcome the problem of taking away the wrong message out of it is really, well, you have to think about the emotions that you're expecting the players to come out of it, right? Like with design, one of the big emotional outcomes that we wanted was this feeling of hope coming out of the game, the feeling that there is a future, that there's something that we're working towards, right? And very mechanically, like we did that through this process of restricting communication and then letting players build something together, and that collaborative nature and just looking back on what you're able to achieve was really important for that. In particular, it's also very central to why we use language in so many of our games. One of the outstanding things and one of the ways in which we achieve hope is like an emotional kind of counterpoint to the content of that game is with how our brains process language. And how that is such a fundamental thing within all of us, and how we're able to do such amazing things with language, right? And by looking at those special mechanical tools that you have at your disposal, I think you gain access to this tool of emotions that you can try to elicit from your players. And then juxtaposing that with content can be the thing that really drives a lot forward.
Yes, on the topic of taking away the wrong or right message, or what you get out of a learning experience, one of the things that we've found more important than anything else, like no matter what kind of learning LARP you're making, you need to have some sort of structured or formalized post work after the LARP has ended. And we actually have done a lot of work with this and looked at situations where that doesn't happen. And what we took away from that, it also ties into some pre-existing learning theory. I'm not going to go into that with like cognitive psychologists and that kind of stuff, but this one like developmental psychologist called Piaget. He has this theory about that when you experience something new and you're going to learn something from that experience, and that experience might challenge your pre-existing understanding of the world, you get some sort of cognitive discomfort, and this can happen in a learning art process. For instance, we've been working with pre and post work for these large games in Norway where 15-year-olds experience like what it's like to be a refugee, and then they have all of these new experiences that they can choose to do one of two things with. And that's what Piaget calls assimilation versus accommodation. And if you assimilate something, you very much take it into your pre-existing concept of what the world looks like. And if something doesn't compute with that, you kind of have to throw it away to diminish your cognitive discomfort. But what you can also do is to accommodate it, and then you kind of have to expand your understanding of the world to make room for that new knowledge, and that is very much what we want our participants in our games to do. But to do that, you kind of need to have afterwork that caters to doing that, and that's a combination of being allowed to talk about your experience, listening to other people's experience, and also having some form of formal teaching to contextualize the experience that you had, and then you can kind of incorporate it and create and build new knowledge.
So I would say, thinking about content and design in doing programs for kids and teens on the autism spectrum, the two things that I think about a lot are, don't be afraid to go with something that's familiar. Don't be afraid to go with kind of something that maybe feels like, oh, this is just the same old story with these same old cliches or the same old tropes. But then again, thinking about that assimilation and accommodation concept, not necessarily how can we throw this out and do something totally different, but how can we take this and build on it, stretch it a little bit, make this character encounter something new or something different, or a situation that maybe they haven't encountered before. So part of this is because folks on the spectrum a lot of times rely on stories that are stable to give a sense of consistency and coherence. So I'll tell a quick story. I was interviewing a college student on the autism spectrum, and he was saying his freshman year had been really, really difficult. And he was in this dorm room, and he said, the thing that made it hardest was on my dorm room, on my door, I had this towel rack, and it kept falling off. And I would put it back on, but it kept falling off. And he said, it seems like such a small thing, but it made me feel like I don't know where I am. So this idea that this small change in a detail could transform the nature of the whole. There are some theories about what's different about cognition in folks on the autism spectrum. Part of it might have to do with the tendency to look at individual details and relate them to each other. About how does this fit with this fit with this fit with this, rather than pulling it together into a big picture. Oh, this is my room. So when one thing in that system changes, a piece of furniture changes, it's like it's not the same room anymore. So all this is to say that when kids on the spectrum come to a camp and they want to play the same old story about, the tragic figure from the village who his whole family was killed, and he has these monstrous powers that he's struggling to control, and he's dark on the outside, but really his heart is very good. That's great. Go with it. And then the other thing, but maybe find a way to introduce one new thing into that story. Just make it a little bit bigger. And then the other thing I think are these stories about integration, these kinds of narratives that tend to be stories of conflicting forces that coexist. I'm half human and half demon. I have this force within me that takes over and transforms me into somebody totally different than I was before. I noticed that a lot of the kids on the spectrum really love these stories. They really get into these stories of kind of coexisting opposites, forces that need to be integrated with each other. I think that has something to do with some of the experiences that they have, where it's sometimes really hard for them to keep themselves together, for them to kind of organize their own kind of thoughts or behaviors or feelings when the world feels really overwhelming. And I think it also has to do with growing up being told that you have this thing. You know, we have this way of talking about conditions like autism that's like, you have autism, you know, it's like, and maybe even people sometimes say, you know, oh, I wish I could cure your autism. I wish we could, you know, prevent this thing from happening. And so I think these kids are growing up grappling with these sort of questions of, well, is this me? Is this not me? Who am I? What's part of me? What's not part of me? And some of these stories about figuring that out, I think can be really, really important to working through some of those tensions and also helping people figure out ways to talk about it with each other. So I think, yeah, I think looking at kind of the content of the stories and also the form of the stories, some of these really kind of what might feel like very kind of classic narratives can be really, really powerful in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, that actually segues really well into one of the other questions that I wanted to talk about, which is, you know, you've all done work with marginalized people, you know, games about disability, games for people with disabilities. Anna, you mentioned earlier today your work, you know, about people living under occupation. So these are people who, you know, whose stories absolutely need to get told, but also, you know, how do you go about telling those stories responsibly? You know, with respect for those people, how do you gather the information responsibly? How do you make sure that you are respecting those stories? What are some of the design techniques and, you know, best practices for research that you can use when you're dealing with stories by and for and about marginalized people? Anna, yeah.
Well, from my perspective at least, when we started working with the Palestinian community, it was very much like, the way the project began was me and Martin, who gave the keynote with me, sitting in an office been working with the Belarusians. Should we try to find someone else to partner up with? That could be fun. And then Martin was like, yeah, I met this one guy from Palestine a couple of years ago, and he seemed really cool. Maybe I should just email him and see if he's interested in doing some LARP stuff. And that's very much where it began. And the first time we met them, we really wanted to figure out, like, what are we going to do? And of course, like, being under occupation and having severe travel restrictions and all kinds of things, like, make the Palestinian community very marginalized. But then there's the other part of it, which is that it's a population that's extremely highly educated and in many ways extremely similar to us. So we found it very easy to kind of figure out what we're going to do, because they immediately took control of what they wanted to do, and then we just went with it. They were the ones who suggested that we do projects that were not about occupation, but that were centered around Palestinian culture without being defined by occupation. They were also the ones who decided that the LARP would be about a wedding, and who did a lot of the cultural design surrounding that. That was actually also very interesting, because what they told me afterwards is, like, we had to do a ton of research, like, on our own culture to actually make this into a LARP that we felt that we could present as our culture to you guys coming, so that we wouldn't, like, trick you, or, like, we had to feel that it was real. And we also had a lot of very absurd interactions, like, from our perspective, where we were like, yeah, but, you know, to make it easier for the Nordic players and also maybe, like, more believable in the fiction, maybe we should try to incorporate some Nordic wedding traditions into this. And then this one guy just leans back and goes, no, we can't do that. That would be a fantasy LARP. Well, it can be really nice to, like, work without the pre-existing, like, misconceptions about what LARP can and cannot be, but that was really funny to us. So I think, like, we were very privileged in them taking so much control, but also, like, had to really hand over the wheel and accept that things were done in a different way than we might have expected. And I also think that's a good thing to do when you're working on these kinds of cultural exchanges.
I think, for me, thinking about how to respect where these players are coming from, where these folks are coming from, For me, the biggest thing has been not expecting people to trust too fast. Not expecting players to be able to just immediately jump in and bond or connect with each other or disclose personal information or take risks. That a lot of times these are folks who have been kind of demoralized, who have had a lot of experiences of rejection, a lot of them have been bullied, a lot of folks have tried various ways of offering themselves to other people and had it not work out. And so there's a real kind of tentative, slow quality that I've had to learn to respect and just be like, okay, if you two people have a conflict with each other that seems a little tiny bit playful and has a little bit of warmth to it, like, that's big, that's progress. Like, I need to support that. You know, that's a kind of engagement that I need to make space for and not be assuming that everything has to be sweetness and light and openness the way that I might have expected it to be.
I'd love to chime in. So with ours, our problem was also very different in a lot of ways because about the game being about Nicaraguan Sign Language. Nicaraguan Sign Language is a language that I think the last number I saw of the estimated total speakers in the year 1997 was 3,000. Being a language with only 40 or so, but that's only 40 or so years old, there are very, very few speakers, right? And on top of that, there are of years of research, we were not able to find a native speaker who we felt had the right context to evaluate it as a game, right? Because just finding someone who comes from that community and have them read it and say, this looks fine to me, a lot of times is doing a disservice, right? And implying a kind of write-off that they're not really giving, right? Because they don't know how people are actually interacting with it, and they're making a lot of assumptions based on that. And you're just, a lot of times it can just be you willingly ignoring that fact and putting their stamp on it anyway, even though you might have misgivings about their ability to evaluate the work because they're not familiar with the medium. And so for us, one of the most difficult parts of that was the fact that any signal that we got by nature had to be incomplete, right? We could talk to lots of native speakers, which was its own can of worms, because as far as I know, there are less than 5 who speak, who can read and write English as well. We often went through multiple layers of translations to be able to have interviews about the game. But also we had to find people who were more embedded in the game space who might have certain ties to the experience, like deaf barbers in the United States, for example. Those were some people who had at least somewhat related experiences who could evaluate it more as a game. And so I think that's just something that's really important to keep in mind. We often talk about this consultation and the fact that you need to talk to people, but keeping in mind that not everyone might be able to evaluate it as the thing that you're actually presenting it as, or the thing that it's going to be experienced as, is very delicate. And you shouldn't just accept people's write-off as like a rubber stamp that you're willing to put on your games, right?
Yeah, thank you. That was all super important and exactly the kind of discussion that I was hoping to have. And if we circle back to it later, I have a feeling we will circle back to it later because a lot of these questions are going to come back to how do we do this responsibly? How do we do this effectively? I want to segue into the educational mission of these games, which is related in a lot of ways, I think. And so I want to talk about some of the things, games about learning language, games that are intended as teaching tools. How do the design elements support the educational mission of the game? Elizabeth and Anna, you both talked about sort of the process of gently getting people out of their comfort zone and into a new area of competence. And I'd like to talk some more about the design elements that can do that, but also, with an eye to this responsible design. How do you know you're calibrating the push out of the comfort zone properly? How can you tell that you're getting people just stretched enough without making it so risky that, that they can't do it, or they get discouraged, or, that it becomes irresponsible. Yeah.
Well, I mean, with the autism spectrum stuff, if the players are in the game, if they're doing the thing, if they're playing the characters and interacting with each other and co-creating a shared imaginative world, it's happening. The interesting thing being that these activities are not only the things that these youth often struggle with the most, perspective taking, nonverbal communication, social coordination, co-creating a shared mental world, but also, unfortunately, it's the stuff that they need the most practice at and get the least practice at, because we live in a society where social opportunities are things you have to win. That you don't just have friends, you have to get people to want to hang out with you by displaying certain competencies. So if you don't have that stuff on the outset, it's kind of hard to get those experiences. So I think, for me, I feel like if somebody is in the game and doing the thing and seeming to be having a good time and fairly engaged with it, I feel like that's happening. The practice is happening, the opportunity is happening, and I really just look forward to somebody seem like they're having fun. And if I talk to them about it afterwards, did they say they were having fun? And based on what I know about them, does it seem like they're telling me the truth as opposed to just telling me what they need to tell me to get me way? So I'm always thinking about, are there other ways to evaluate that? We were talking about this a lot at the EduLARP conference, or the event, the pre-conference. And I think it's really hard with social stuff. When you're talking about social comfort, when you're talking about things that are co-created between two people, nobody has social skills in a vacuum, right? We have this idea that social skills are these things that you kind of carry around in your little picnic basket, but that's not how sociality works, right? Sociality is something that happens between people. So how do you measure an individual's sociality and how it's changed? I think the more time I spend thinking about this, the more I think there's something we have to change about the very way that we think about assessment to get at this. Haven't quite figured out how to do it yet, but that's sort of what I'm toying with. And and until I get there, it's just much more a question of can you make it happen? Can you those moments where you see and feel it coalesce? And it's there.
Yeah, that was going to be another one of my questions, which is how do you assess this and how do you measure it? Apparently the answer is we don't know yet.
I don't give some
Yeah.
And if they do, I wish they'd tell me.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think a lot about during design and this possibility of pushing players into more uncomfortable spaces, I think it's super duper important to be able to give players during any individual session of the game the ability to engage or disengage as much as they might be comfortable with at that particular moment in time. And one concept that's been super helpful for me when thinking about this in my own design was a concept that Jay Lee defined a couple years ago in a blog post, I think, called the root of a game. And what Jay Lee was talking about with the root was, what do I need to be doing in this game to consider myself to still be successfully playing the game, right? And that's something that completely blew my mind out of the water when I actually thought of this. Because in a lot of ways, if a game doesn't really give you very strict instructions as to what you need to be doing to consider yourself correctly playing the game at a given point in time, then the assumption can often be, well, I need to be maximally engaging with it, right? And how much I'm not engaging with it is how much I'm failing at correctly playing this game, right? If we're giving the situation where we're just okay, now have a scene and do this, if you're just feeling out of it, or you're feeling low energy, or you just don't feel like you can put all of yourself into it, then that might feel like a failure on your part. You might feel like I'm not doing this correctly. So one of the things that we did in one of our games, for example, with dialects, where you do have scenes together and you're creating language, we very consciously said the scenes that you have one particular requirement. You have to use the word you just defined. And that's it, right? You can engage as heavily with the story you're telling, or you can pull back as much as you want based on your emotional availability at the time, or just how much you're feeling like you want to engage at that point in time, and you're still correctly playing the game, right? You don't have to worry about whether or not you're being a bad player.
You did the thing that the rules told you to do. And that's been something that's just been a really, really important thing in evolving my thoughts on how to give players different levels of being able to engage at different points in time in the game.
One of the things that we think a lot about in our company when we design LARPs that have like a very specific learning or teaching goal is a theory that is called like the proximate zone of development, which kind of takes into consideration where you are, like your knowledge level and where you're comfortable with being, and like what kind of challenges you need to be pushed a little bit further without it being uncomfortable. And you have like the comfort zone where you're completely comfortable with what you're doing, you know how to do it and know how to solve the tasks. And then you have the angst zone, which is like the other part of the spectrum where you have no idea what you're going to do and it's really complicated and you don't have the tools. And then in between you have this proximate zone of development where you can maybe solve the task with some help. And in our case, the LARP is the help. So to give some concrete examples, we designed a game to teach teenagers how to do political lobbyism. And the way we try to do that is first know our target group, know which level they're at. And then we try to adapt the game to that. And the way we do that is that we do some pre-education before we start the game, where we teach them about like how does lobbyism work and at which parts of the political process is a good idea to get into it. And then we do a very, very practical little LARP where we address some things that can be really difficult to do when it's the first time you do them. Like picking up the phone and calling a politician and setting up a meeting and doing that in an appropriate way, and then actually meeting them, presenting your case, learning how to like make a small note that you can give to the politician. Like it's really, really hands-on. And then our hope is that afterwards they've tried it once in a LARP with people who are acting as politicians, opposing them, and that will make it easier and they would have like expanded their proximate zone of development a little bit into their angst zone when they're done. Another example of something we do is that we make a lot of LARPs for museums where the target group are children who are going to appreciate the art in some way. And actually our main like customer group are abstract art museums, where you have this really like abstract art that can be kind of hard to grasp even if you're an adult. And this is, we do several things in this design to make it accessible for children. Firstly, we design an art brain, and the art brain is made in a way so that only children can enter it. So they have to kind of crawl through a tunnel, which makes it accessible only to them, so it's obviously for them, right? And then they go through a set of in-game training for how to look at the art, where they move through different rooms that represent different emotions, where there are LARPers who teach them like how to see different emotions in art and ask them questions and kind of teach them how to do this. And then we give them a very strong alibi of being art agents, and the art agents have to go out into the museum to categorize this new art and try to figure out what it means, and then take it back into the art brain, which is only accessible to them. So then they have this alibi of being art agents, which allows them to look at the art and interpret the art the way they want themselves. And then they start interacting with the museum in a completely different way than they did previously. And especially the alibi, I think, is really important for like taking them out of the angst zone of not knowing what to do and is this for me, and into a more like proximate zone of development type of place.
Yeah, that's great. And actually leads into something else I wanted to ask about, which is designing for kids. Because, you know, that's something that you've done, that you've all done, designing for kids, games about kids, and, you know, the specific challenges in that, because kids can be a tough audience, but also really great. So, yeah, I'd love it if you could talk about some other design techniques that work especially well with, you know, educational games for kids or these kinds of support games specifically for kids, it would work better with them than maybe they would with adults.
I'll start on this a little bit. So I've worked with kids and with teenagers. I would say that kids, the first thing that comes to mind is just kids have a lot of techniques very close at hand. They're very used to doing worksheets. They're very used to drawing. And so it's very easy for them to move into those kinds of activities and tasks. And so I think having lots of those kinds of things available for them, I think it's in some ways easier for kids maybe to engage in those kinds of tasks because they're really used to it. And then just thinking about time, you know, kids get exhausted faster than mostly adults, or at least sometimes more abruptly than adults do. So being even more careful to think about, all right, when are we going to be eating? When are we going to be breaking? When are we going to be using the restroom? How long can we play at a stretch? It's gotten me thinking about time and just energy in a slightly different way. Individual energies, but also the energy in the room and how is it going. So there are probably lots more things, but those are the two that come to mind right away.
Well, I actually often find it easier to design for kids than teens. So I would like to maybe address that a bit as well.
Oh yeah, definitely, like the special concerns of designing for different ages as well, yeah.
I think one of the main challenges that we face when we design for teenagers is that they usually don't have a choice when it comes to if they're going to participate in our LARP or not, because it happens within some sort of formal learning structure, like their school or their confirmation courses or something like that, so they kind of have to be part of it, and it can be really challenging to design for mandatory participation. And there are some things that we try to do when designing for teenagers who have no experience with LARP. And the first is to create a space of trust and safety. And for us, this is very much about telling them exactly what's going to happen and not tricking them. Like, not tricking them into learning something, but actually telling them what they're supposed to learn, and like not have any weird plot twists or anything like that. But this is actually really important because on a metacognitive level, when you're learning something, you have to understand what you're supposed to learn. Because if you don't understand what you're supposed to learn, or if you're participating in a LARP and you don't really know how to LARP, then you just keep thinking about, like, am I doing this right? Or what am I supposed to look at? Instead of looking for the things that we told you that you're going to look for, because this is what you're going to learn right now. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make when they design learning games, because they think so much about, like, how is this LARP going to be fun, and we need a lot of like secrets and mystery and plot twists and stuff. And that might not be as good for learning. Another thing we try to do is to create a strong sense of alibi. We can do this with costumes or stuff like that, so they kind of feel like they're someone else. And then use that as a way to distinguish between themselves as a person and their character that they're going to play. And the third thing is that when we design for teenagers, more than for children actually, we apply a less co-creation strategy. Because for people who are not used to LARPing, co-creation can be extremely hard. And it can actually be like a barrier for learning, because again, you have the thing like, am I doing this right? Like, how am I supposed to LARP good? I don't get it. Instead of, what am I supposed to learn? So it kind of distracts them from the purpose of what we're doing.
I've never designed anything for kids, but I've
You
designed
game
things
about kids,
That's
yeah.
true,
That's
that's
what
true.
and I'm curious about that. Like, how do you encourage adults to play as kids?
Oh, you don't really have to. It's one of the things that requires least prompting. It's like, okay, now be a kid, and it's like, all right, I can do that. Right? Like, it's actually one of the most natural ways to get adults to kind of give themselves a tremendous amount of alibi, especially when it just comes up to approaching other people, right? Like, kids just seem to do it without a problem, and even asking an adult to embody a child, it's surprising how much of the general social, like, stigmas that we usually, like, carry with us do kind of go away. So it's definitely a nice tool to keep in mind.
It's one of the few experiences we've all had.
Yeah, it's true. Awesome. Before we open up to audience questions, I want to ask one last question of each of our panelists, sort of a two-parter. Have you ever encountered resistance to the mission of your game, and how did you overcome it? And conversely, what's your greatest success story with the mission of your game? I'll let you think. Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Back to the teens, the story for discussion.
Resistance.
Well, when designing for teenagers who haven't chosen to be part of your game, there will be a lot of resistance, but usually in the form of like people making fun of the fiction. For instance, we do this game at a museum in Norway that is for teenagers where they play out a Norwegian village during the German occupation in the Second World War. And here we have different groups who play both German soldiers and Norwegian soldiers and a lot of different stuff. And most of the teenagers take it really seriously and they kind of want to play the game. And then you have like usually like 5 to 10 people who are all about like running around, yelling like Nazi slurs and that kind of stuff. And we have several strategies for handling this. The most severe one is taking people out of the game. If they're not taking it seriously, we have to remove them from the game. We usually try not to do that. One of the other things that I've found to be very successful, especially if you have them in the more like soldiery type groups, we have an adult in each group. To a lot of the people who make a lot of noise, they really want some attention, right? So if you kind of give them a character that tells them that they're going to get a little bit more attention, like for instance, you can play my assistant or my second in command or something like that, that might work very well with some of them. And also I have great experience with, like, people also make a lot of noise when they're bored, so it might be an indication that you have to delegate more play and more tasks in the game. And this is really hard. It takes a lot of training as like the adult responsible LARP runner who's supposed to do this. And yeah, it's exceptionally difficult, but with more experience it gets easier, and we try to kind of train our volunteers to be able to do this.
So this isn't something that I had personal experience with, I'll get to that in a second, but the thing you talked about putting in adults in the group reminded me of a very interesting story that I heard from a designer at IndieCade this year. This was a designer, I forget his name unfortunately, but he runs this experience called The Incredible Amazing Game, something like that. In that it's like this, it takes place in auditoriums, and he has all these weird games you play with weird controllers, and people come up from the audience, and he's like in a wacky hat up front, and he's like doing all these weird things. And one of the things that he would do often is he would run them for kids, right? Like he would have kids come up, and he said that there were a ton of places where this could go so incredibly wrong, because the kids would just keep trying to one-up each other, right? They would try to be weirder and wackier, do more and more things. It's like, how did you end up solving that? And he was like, well, we just put an adult with them, and all the kids cared about was one-upping the adults. And like, they didn't compete with each other anymore. They just were like, we'll just make fun of the adults, and the adult doesn't really care, and like it diffused everything. But that was a very interesting, funny story that I took away from that, at least. Anyways, on to less funny things. The biggest challenge, the biggest criticism that we've obviously gotten with Sign, and I think this is really the gorilla in the room talking about Sign, is whether or not we were the right people to make it, right? Me and my partner are, neither of us are from the country, we're both hearing, and so it's a very reasonable criticism of the game about whether or not we were the right people to be making it in the first place. And that's something that we've dealt with a lot over the course of years, and trying to do good by the story itself and by our involvement in the story. Ben, I'd be happy to talk more about that process over the course of questions, but that's probably the biggest pushback that we've gotten. As for the biggest success, it was probably just over the fact that like this has been a very big concern of ours and something that we've taken very seriously. I don't want to dismiss this as a concern at all. But as we talked about in our keynote, actually getting this level of like acceptance and buy-in from the communities in Nicaragua who invited us there and now like consider us like actors and people who we can who are actually involved to some extent in their story and what we can help them do was probably the biggest, most meaningful thing to come out of that process for us.
So I would say, if I think about the mission of some of these camps or groups that I've tried to run as being helping people who are involved think about themselves and experience themselves as part of a group, and that group needing every single person to be there and make their contribution, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that everybody has a place, and that it's not just about each of us as our own little people, it's about what can we create when we are all together and we all have a part to play. I think what's been challenging about that, honestly, is from parents who are very used to saying, oh, well, you know, Annie has soccer practice this afternoon, so she can't come to the group. Or, oh, your game is the first weekend of July, you know, I totally forgot that's when we have the country house, so we're just gonna have to pull her out. And figuring out how to explain how contrary to the mission of the whole program that this is. And that's teaching exactly the opposite of what we've been trying to teach this whole time, is that you too have to think about, well, this isn't just about what's best for Annie. This is about what's best for the system that Annie's a part of, and we want Annie and everybody involved to be thinking a little bit more in that way. I think that's probably been, to the point that I've gotten resistance to something I think of as being central to the mission of what we're trying to do. I think it's that. And the biggest triumph, I don't know, I think about probably the biggest like yes moment I had at one of these camps was about a similar issue. So the way that it was set up, you guys who were at the camps panel heard a little bit about this, but the way we had set it up was the first 2 weeks we had older teens doing the camps, and then the second 2 weeks, the older teens were CITs and younger teens came in and were campers. And so this gave the older teens a lot of challenges to deal with, and one of them was this issue of if your character is slain in game, you have to come back as a member of the troll army or whatever it was. I think they were orcs. You have to come back as a member of the orc army. And there was this one kid who was so into his character. He developed the character, he loved the character, he was playing the character all week, and he kept saying, my character is killed, I'm not coming back as an orc. My character is killed, I'm not coming back as an orc. He kept saying, yes you are. Yes you are. Yes, this is going to happen. And finally, like right before the game, he said, all right, my character is killed. I'll come back as an orc. And he did, and it was a great game. It was a really powerful experience for him. So I think that made me feel like, yes, progress, good. Yay for returning orcs.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. All right, we'll just start going around that way. 1, and then 2, and then 3.
Okay, so this is not a question about assessment, because I know that's probably very difficult to truly do. But a lot of these games would maybe be done for institutions or nonprofits or people that have, as someone that works for a nonprofit and is asked to give metrics that don't really mean anything. So have you had to try to explain to any institutions like what they can expect from your game and like just kind of dealing with that relationship where maybe they don't even understand LARP, but you're trying to explain how you're going to report back to them?
That's awesome. The question, to repeat into the mic, was how do you explain to the institutions, grant funding institutions or organizational institutions, how do you explain the metrics when there are no metrics? How do you explain to the larger organizations?
Well, we had a long role for several years that started with us actually being hired by a large organization in Norway to assess the effects of a role-playing game that they'd been running for years that we didn't provide for them. I unfortunately can't really talk about the results because we don't own them, but what I can say is that they afterwards hired us to make pre- and post-LARP like educational stuff for them to go with those games to kind of enhance the learning output. But then we had the interesting experience of going around to all of the different local chapters of this organization and trying to kind of teach them how to do this, because like our main contract was with the central organization, right? And there we experienced some pushback with their time management, right? Because they were used to like just sending their kids these games and just expecting that the learning would come by itself, but then maybe it didn't, and then they had to invest much more time. We found it quite useful to lean on some of the pre-existing learning theories that I've also like mentioned to use as tools to kind of explain why these kinds of experiences can't stand alone. They have to be part of a bigger process to actually work, especially when you're trying to teach some sort of knowledge, but also when you're trying to invoke some kind of change in how these kids see the world. Because if you don't do that, then it's just an isolated event, and it might have been fun or exciting, and they might have gotten some new friends, but they will lack the context. And just leaning on pre-existing theory has been useful, but now there's also a lot more LARP-specific theory in the making as well that I hope will help.
Bibliography.
And I'll just say, I think collaboration has made a big difference. You know, I see part of my own kind of participation as an academic to be to document certain things and to figure out how to kind of translate what happens in the game into language or rhetoric or terminology or concepts that would be familiar to different kinds of audiences. And so I think sometimes kind of setting up these mutually beneficial relationships. It was, you know, it was great for me to have the opportunity to do the research too, because I was doing a dissertation. And so now I'm supervising graduate students, and I'm always kind of thinking about where can you go to do your study that will be helpful for you, but that will also produce something that will be useful for the people that you're working with. So I think kind of collaboration with people who can language what's happening in different ways, I think can be useful too.
Cool. I think you were next.
Yes. I feel like the thing that I struggle with the most when writing games is if I have a particular purpose or a message or something like that, like how to strike a good balance between it being fun and it feeling heavy-handed or preachy. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
That is among the $64,000 questions.
I might have missed you talking about that before I got here.
It
so I
really
apologize.
is.
I mean, allegory for me, that's what it's always been. It's always been like finding stories that have thematic resonances but are in a very different kind of place and time.
Sure.
For me, part of it has always been just like during the initial creative process, really considering both of them together too. Like, what games am I equipped to say something about, but also what games am I equipped to make something engaging and fun about too, right? Like, just think about my own story, for example. Like, if I want to make a game that was very personal to me, like my history at the moment is I come from a family that's like half Muslim and half voted for Donald Trump, right? Like, and that's a very difficult situation, and I'd love to tell that story. I have zero idea how to make an engaging game about that, right? Like, and I'm not that interested in putting a whole bunch of mental energy into it. I don't even know if it's possible. And that's okay, to me at least. And that's also like the fact that me and my partner are so equipped in terms of language, and just that we've found a lot of ways to make engaging systems around language has also informed what we pick as our topics, right? So in a lot of ways, picking one particular topic and then trying to like fit your tools into that can be very difficult, if not impossible, for some things. So for us at least, like starting with the tools we have and what we think we can make something engaging about, and then using that to inform which stories we tell, at least for us, and I'm sure not how how everyone goes about this process has been generally how we find what stories we tell.
To me, it sounds like write what you know.
Was it?
To me, it sounds like write what you know.
Well, no. Like, I know the story of my experience in my family much more intimately than any of the stories in any of the other games we made, right? But it's right what you know in terms of, like, game making and design, I guess, right? And not necessarily just around content, right? I think a lot of times people start from content and then try to develop their toolbox into something that works with that, which is great a lot of times. But for us, at least, and I can only talk about our specific creative process, and like everyone's creative processes are different. For us, we have a very natural toolbox, and we use that to inform what types of things that we tell. And maybe that means like finding adjacent stories that are better suited for your toolbox in particular. I hope that doesn't come off as discouraging or anything, but just in general, that's how our creative processes work.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question to answer because like it depends so much on which age group you're working with and their previous level of experience, both with LARP and the topic you want to make a game about. Like for younger kids, I think it's more important that it's like fun and interesting and playful, and then when you move to older groups, it becomes increasingly important that it's also somewhat intellectually stimulating to them, of course, on different like levels, and that you have like many ways to interact with the game. We have had a lot of success with making sure that everyone has simple tasks to do. For some reason, people think that's really fun and interesting to just do random things in the game while they're playing, even if it's like cutting paper into pieces or like some task that makes them feel like they are interacting with what's going on. And when it comes to the being preachy part, I'm not sure if that's exactly what you meant when you asked, but I think that when you're working with LARP, you have to, at some kind of level, accept that it is a co-creative process, so you can't control the message 100% like you can with a lot of other mediums. But again, I believe that the combination between allowing the participants to discuss and debate and share their experience, and also try to put in some teaching for contextualization is like the magic combination.
And you're next, and then you, and then you. All right, we'll go back around. 1, 2, 3.
So I run an educational summer camp LARP that explores cultures, and so I was very interested in your point about when you receive some criticism. We actually hire a cultural consultant each year from the culture that we're exploring. And they have absolute control over all of our stories, props, costumes, how we're presented, and we even have them playing a role at our camp. So I'd like to know how you handle the criticism of being not of a specific culture or subculture that you were exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first part, so we also, we have, as part of the game, we have official sensitivity consultation from the culture. We have done multiple interviews other than that to try to get people's feelings and stuff. So like we've done some work on that, but onto the question of like how do we handle that criticism? Yes. So I think there's a few different ways in which I could be interpreting that question, and I want to make sure I'm doing the right one. Do you mean in terms of like what concrete steps do we do to address this as a problem in the game, or why do we choose to make games around topics like
Yes.
that? All of them? Okay. Well, the reason why we choose to make games, like the reason why we chose to make that game, kind of comes back to the discussion we had here too, right? Like there's games that you are equipped to tell in many different dimensions, right? Like, and because of how equipped we are in terms of our game design toolkit for language, right? Like, that's just something that we can tell, and we can tell pretty effectively. That's why we chose to delve into these topics in particular. You know, neither me or my partner speak an endangered language, but our second game dialect is about endangered languages. For that, we hired a lot of writers who do have firsthand personal experiences about endangered languages. We have authors in the book around stuff like that, so we do all the due diligence that we can. But the reason why we continue to make those games is because we want to make games that are important and meaningful and that tell stories that we believe that can be told, that we are equipped to tell, right? Like, and here the reason why we're equipped to tell these is because of our design toolkits, right? Like it's the things that we're mechanically good at telling, right? And that's what directs us towards those things, rather than trying to choose a story that might be more personally relevant, but we just don't have the toolkit to be able to tell. I feel like I grabbed some parts of your question and not all of them. Is there anything else that you want to ask?
I think you hit on the difference between toolkit and content.
Yeah, and like, but one thing that I do want to come out of this with is that this is a very legitimate criticism, right? And this is something that me and my partner think of as like a major thing that is part of our job to convince anyone who's interested in playing this game, who is concerned this game in any way, like this is something that we need to convince you is being handled correctly,
Yes.
right? That's a mentality that I think is really important to go into these with. I don't think you should disqualify yourself from trying to tell these stories, even as a primary designer, if it's not your story, but you should go into it with the idea that the burden is on you here if you're going to do this, to both handle it responsibly and to convince people that you handled it responsibly. So I hope that was helpful.
Okay, you're next.
Okay, I was actually going to weigh in on your question about preachiness and design, and you guys chime in. But I had a few thoughts about what you're talking about. The first would be when designing your game, try not to frame anything in terms of right and wrong answers. I think you speaking earlier about like setting up your game beforehand and then having a dedicated period after. This is a critical part, I believe, of any kind of educational game. So you set up certain expectations about the subject matter that you're going to be exploring, and then the mechanics of your game should allow people to explore the things that you've identified, in which it's kind of impossible for them to go wrong with the thing. Choices where they're balancing priorities, and then maybe your job as a proctor or someone running it later on is to identify these moments in game so that when you get to the end, you can talk to the participants about it, allow them to tell what was going on with them in their own words, and start a conversation among themselves about these kind of competing ideas so that they're articulating maybe the thing that you're trying to get to in what you're calling preachiness. Okay? In the same way that when we design a LARP, we have to create space for the gamers to take it. Like, you can only go so far, and there's the space of the player decision, right, and player agency. Let them be the ones to take it. That you have to have faith that your players will do that, and they will. And maybe as a final little thing, one trick I know that will kind of prove this to you if you do these games is you ask students at the end, because you need to reinforce these lessons, right? That's how it makes it. You can't just experience the game. You do need to have them articulate what they learn, but you can't be the ones who tell them what they learn. But if you say, so when you go home today and a parent or a friend asks you what you learned from playing this game, then the most amazing things will come out of their mouths, and they own it. And is that
Probably things I didn't even intend to put in the game. Sometimes.
well, but you also should be asking, what's your actual subject matter?
Sure.
Because maybe even like the more general is better. Like, did they learn about communication or decision making or empathy? Like these are kind of core spaces in LARP that we explore. Sorry, not a question. I apologize.
Okay, thank you. I want to make sure we have time for more questions. You're up next.
Question for Anna. Earlier you mentioned that one of the most effective techniques in your experience for getting across the mission of the game developer themselves is pre and post game work. and obviously the nature of the work is going to depend on the message that you're trying to get across. Have you found any types of generalization that apply to what is most effective?
Like pre-LARP?
I think post-LARP is actually what I'm most interested in because I've seen a lot of variation in what people do for post-LARP work, and I'm wondering if something is more effective than others.
I think there are several components that need to be there in varying degrees, and like the way we think about our learning games is very much like you have a starting point with the people you're trying to teach something to, and then there's this also this whole theoretical framework about like the process of unfreezing your knowledge and then refreezing it afterwards. And the LARP is kind of the unfreeze process, so you don't actually learn that much during the LARP itself, and then if you just leave them hanging, the refreezing will happen in a random way that you don't control. But the components that we try to incorporate are the possibility to share your experience, and also the possibility to listen to other people's experience, to have the opportunity to clear up misconceptions about what went on during the game, either between the participants or with help from the game runners, and then this is like immediately after the game, and then having a process that can happen later on where you provide contextualization. Like for instance, with these games about being refugees that we made the pre and post work for, contextualization is very much about like discussing and talking about like how does this experience you had where you were in the forest for 24 hours and you were like hungry and tired and you had to walk for long periods of time and you were probably cold and you didn't get any sleep and that kind of stuff. Like why did we do that? Like how does that relate to the real world? And of course a lot of them kind of already have an idea about how that relates to the real world, but it's also important to kind of discuss it and then do some teaching to build on top of that, if that's what you want to do, like how the refugee situation in Europe right now has affected Norway, for instance, like what we should do about it, and then you can take it to the next level of reflection, like in light of your experience, how do you feel about these issues now, and do you think we should do anything differently, how does the media portray this, and that kind of stuff. So we've designed a lot of tools for how to do that. We have a manual, we have a lot of those tools if you're interested. But it's a process that takes time. You can't do all of this right after the game, and that's also like a part of it. Then you do recollection and that kind of stuff, and then you kind of go more into the teaching over time.
If I could add one tiny thing to that too, just a little personal thing that I've observed a few times in terms of contextualizing after the game, just because of whatever people bring into a game without the contextualization stage at the end. It is amazing how people will misinterpret, like some small amount of people will misinterpret anything you try to do incredibly violently, right? Like I run a lot of games at Games on Demand at various conventions, and afterwards we'll have a little debrief, and like good games that I think are doing a very good job at getting their point across that aren't my games that I've run there. I've been amazed by how badly people have misinterpreted the act after the game. So having these stages is like super important for a lot of reasons, but because some people might come out with a different, like with the mischaracterization of it too, like I don't think you should see that too big of a failure on your part for like some minority of people. It happens under any circumstance, and that's why these things are so important.
Yeah, I'd say with my group, I think any kind of post-game processing is really important, especially sort of structured stuff. We'll do story circles, go around, everybody tell a story about a particular thing that happened in game. Appreciation circles also work really well. Say something that you appreciated about something another character did. Okay, now say something you appreciated about something another player did. And a lot of times we'll combine that with a kind of a physical movement, just to kind of keep people moving. So, make eye contact with somebody, throw the ball to them, and then tell them something you appreciated about something that they did.
It's
Great, we have time for one more question before people start flooding in for coffee. Yes.
Okay, so Hakan, you were talking about making the amount of required engagement for players variable so that they don't have to they don't feel like they need to be on all the time, and burn out. Is there a way to design for players that are just shy or just quiet? I've run games for a lot of really quiet people, and it's hard for me to tell, or is there like a way to design things so that they can engage, they know that they can engage if they want to, but don't feel like they're put on the spot in that way?
That's a really great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, first of all, some of the things that I think we talked about with the idea of like, what do we have to be doing to consider ourselves successfully playing the game? Like that's one step towards that, but that still doesn't give you a great avenue into like, okay, how do I encourage you to do more though, right? Like how do I get you into that? And usually the way that, gosh, I think that the way that it's most naturally happened in games that I've designed and run is you start off with this thing that allows people to start from a level of like low engagement. But if there is someone at the table who's giving a little more, right? Like, and this isn't something that's directly in the design process, but a lot of time that level of engagement can naturally increase and people's level of comfort can increase both as they get a little bit more comfortable with the system, but as it's also modeled to them during play, right? This isn't a good answer to like how do I mechanically do this, but in practice that's generally how I've seen it happen. Other ways that you can encourage you though. Yeah, I'll have to personally think about it a little bit more, but does anyone have some suggestions?
Okay, sorry, we are out of time and people are going to start coming in for coffee. So thank you very much to our panel.